Hello everyone, my name is Scott Shields. I'm the Associate Director and Chief Curator at the Crocker Art Museum. Welcome to Wayne Thiebaud 100, Paintings, Prints, and Drawings. This is the 8th exhibition that the Crocker has done of Thiebaud's work. The first was in 1951. It was a show called Influences on a Young Painter, Wayne Thiebaud. It's thrilling to be able to host this show on the occasion of Wayne's 100th birthday through 100 works. It's in part a response to his 1951 show in that that show included paintings, prints, and drawings, as does this one. So it's a wide variety of things, from very small works to very large works, to works on paper, to watercolor, to mixed media, to everything that he did over the course of his career are represented, and all of his subjects. So I'm thrilled to take you through. I'm glad you're here. Let's get started. So Wayne Thiebaud was born in Mesa, Arizona. He grew up largely in Long Beach, California. He also spent some time with his family in Utah. He comes from a Mormon family, and so they had a ranch in Utah for a little while. He eventually ended up in our region because he was in the Army Air Corps and was stationed at Mather Field. While he was at Mather Field, he walked past a Quonset hut, he remembers, and he saw inside people doing illustrations and map making, and he said, how does one get involved in this? For a time he thought he was going to be a pilot, and they said, well, can you draw? And he says, I can do cartoons. He'd been doing cartoons for a long time, since a teenager, and so he was brought in, and he actually ended up doing a cartoon strip for the Air Force, and it was called Alec. And so that was one of the things that launched his career. Another one was that he had an internship at Disney early on when he was a teenager, and was actually fired for participating in a labor strike. So he had a short stint at Disney, but his background was really in illustration, cartooning, and things like that. Some of the early works on this wall, this self-portrait from 1947 is quite rare, and it was done while he was working as an illustrator for Rexall Drug in Los Angeles. And it was at that time that he met a man named Robert Mallory, who was also an artist, and encouraged Thiebaud to go forward and make art his career. So he scouted out places to go to school, and he landed on San Jose State and went there. And then there was a new program starting at Sacramento State, and he ended up going to Sacramento State, and that's where he did his work. He then became a teacher during his graduate program at Sacramento State at Sacramento City College. And so he was there and ultimately started to teach at Davis in 1960. So his connections to our region they go back a long way. He said he first visited the Crocker Art Museum 78 years ago in 1942. In 1945, he had his first works shown at the Crocker. He had 2 works in a Kingsley Art Show. And then in 1951, he had his first show called Influences on a Young Painter. So his early works are different than what we know of what he did later. And they are much more abstract, and they're more abstract expressionist. He had gone multiple times to the Bay Area to see work there, and there was a movement going on called the Bay Area Figurative Movement. And in 1957, there was a big show that he saw that was very influential, and it included people like David Park and Richard Diebenkorn and Elmer Bischoff. And he looked at this work, and you can see in this piece, which is called Zither Player from 1959, so 2 years after the show, looks like a Bay Area figurative painting. And he said, I tried to put a lot of abstract expressionist brushwork and strokes because he was conflicted about whether or not his subject matter should even be there. The generation before was the abstract expressionists, and there was a whole period of time when anything representational art was not considered sound art, wasn't considered contemporary. And so the Bay Area figuratives first moved into figuration and representational painting, and Thiebaud then took it one step further. So as I mentioned, Thiebaud was a little bit conflicted, how to set his work apart, how to make representational painting viable when it hadn't been for so long. And he started to experiment, and he started to work with basic forms and shapes. And I think part of that comes out of his reading a book by Earl Loran, which was about the great artist Cezanne. And Cezanne basically said, if you take basic shapes, a sphere, a cube, a cylinder, a triangle, And you know how to paint those? You know how to paint. Well, Thiebaud starts to do that. He takes triangles and he puts them on circles. And he said, suddenly, I had a piece of pie. And so I started to paint the pie, and I thought, this is going to be the end of any serious painter. But he said I couldn't leave it alone. So he does pieces of pie on plates. He does other things of basic shapes, like hamburgers on plates, or cereal boxes, and with a bowl of cereal next to it. It was really revolutionary because the subject matter hadn't been done. If you look at art history, there's very few instances of people doing things like desserts. And when still lifes were done, they were generally an assembly of objects, oftentimes found in nature, put together, apples with other types of fruit or game. But he's doing things that are about our world. And this is a cafeteria counter with pies spread out on them. And so it's totally unique. And he kept going. And then in 1961, he thought, I have enough paintings I'd like to see about getting a show. So he went to New York, and he went to a lot of galleries and basically was turned down by every single one. But he hadn't gone to Alan Stone Gallery. And Alan Stone saw the paintings and wasn't immediately sure that he thought this work had merit. But he said, I was intrigued enough that I thought, okay, we'll give it a try. So he started in a 1962 show with one work, and then in 1962 in the spring had a big show of just Thiebaud, and that show really launched Thiebaud's career. It was incredibly well received. It was in every major art periodical, in the New York Times, in Time Magazine. Time Magazine said he had started the Slice of Cake School. Every painting in the show sold, and museums acquired some, and really it was from that moment on that Thiebaud became Thiebaud. And so since that time, he has continued to do desserts, but he has continued to branch out. And this show will show you that he never rested on his laurels with his desserts, although he's still known for them. The other thing he's often called is a pop artist. In 1962, when Thiebaud had his show in New York City, he was just ahead of this big thing that was about to happen, which was the pop art movement. Later in that same year, the famous critic Clement Greenberg talked about how abstract expressionism had died and pop art had taken over, and Thiebaud was already there, present in the moment. And when I say pop art, I'm talking about people like Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein and Jim Dine and Claes Oldenburg, and they're all doing subjects that can be found in our everyday world. And sometimes the parallels are so striking, but these artists are all coming to this moment. It's like the Zeitgeist is what it's called in German. They're coming to this subject matter, this commonplace subject matter at the same moment in time. Thiebaud's never been comfortable with the pop art movement and his affiliation with it, because he says, I saw myself as a formalist trying to do formal paintings. And so he's been a reluctant pop artist, but later, soon thereafter his show in New York, he starts to be grouped with those artists, and he's having shows, the very first pop art shows he's included in. And the subject matter is similar, but what's different oftentimes is that Thiebaud was always a painter. Andy Warhol did silk screens. Lichtenstein did silk screens. They were trying to remove their hand from the process. But Thiebaud's hand is always present in his paintings. In fact, his paint is half of what makes the paintings, is that they're so built up, and he calls it combing. He takes his brush and he combs the paint. It's just such a love of his material, which Warhol didn't have. I've said before that Thiebaud really seemed to love his pie, but Warhol didn't seem to like soup much. And I think that sets them apart, is there's a celebration as well as a critique of what's in American culture. And that has changed over time as well. So early on, people were reading Thiebaud's paintings as critiques of American culture. Today, they're often termed more celebratory of American culture. So I think our world has gotten more cynical. So what was cynical in Thiebaud's early career is now seen as celebratory. And that's sort of a sad statement as a society, but early on these were seen as critiques of our consumer culture. So after the first Alan Stone show that Thiebaud had in New York in 1962, Thiebaud continued to paint still lifes for a little while, but he determined that he didn't want to just become known as a still life painter. And so he applied for a sabbatical so he could go do figure paintings, life-size figure paintings. And that was his next thing. When he was doing his still lifes, he was often working from memory because he knew the shapes, he knew what things looked like. He started that approach with the figure, and he quickly found out that that wasn't going to work. Figures are so ingrained in people's psyche and their mind, they know if anything is wrong. And so he said the first ones were sort of disastrous, so he needed to find models. And he was still, starting out, and he used his friends and his family as models oftentimes. And so that really launched his next phase of work, which were the figurative paintings in the mid-1960s. His favorite model was Betty Jean Thiebaud, and there she is, seated next to a friend of both Betty Jean and Wayne, is C.K. McClatchy. So not the original C.K. McClatchy, but C.K.'s grandson, C.K. And he was the head of the Sacramento Bee, as his grandfather before him had been. But what's amazing about what Thiebaud does with a figure is that he said prior to this in art history, people were always doing something. They were fighting, they were loving. I wanted to catch people in between moments of doing something, where they were doing nothing. So they are almost like still lifes. And Betty Jean, his wife, said, I knew I was going to be reduced to objectness like a still life of any other kind. The other thing that's amazing about what he does is that by taking away the narrative, he lets you apply your own. So it's not immediately clear, are these people having a fight? Why are their arms crossed? Why are they facing away from each other? You have to fill in those gaps, which makes them actually more dynamic in terms of your interaction with them, because Thiebaud's not giving you all the answers. Thiebaud did figurative paintings that he wanted to do. He didn't so much do portraits. He did a painting of Betty Jean Thiebaud, for instance, but he was using her more as a model. This painting is a little bit unusual in that it seems like a portrait, but it really wasn't meant to be. But that's kind of how it started out. So this is Sterling Holloway, who's an unusual looking gentleman, and he had an unusual voice. And he became an actor and a voiceover person. So he was in lots of movies. He was almost always a comic actor. He was on a lot of TV shows. He's probably most famous in that he was the voice of Winnie the Pooh. He came to Sacramento performing with a music circus and asked Wayne if he would paint his portrait. And Wayne said, I don't really do that, but I could use a model. So if you wanted to model for me, and if you ended up liking it at the end, then maybe I'd sell it to you. Well, he modeled for him. Sterling Holloway liked it, and Sterling bought it and kept it until his death in 1992. And after that time, Thiebaud acquired it back from the estate and has it in his hands. It is a killer painting. Just the way it's handled, the brushwork, just everything about it is just a beautifully constructed painting. Thiebaud thinks a lot about his materials. He has from the beginning, and he continues to do so today. He oftentimes thinks about what is the best way to represent what I'm representing. So in this case, one of my favorite pieces in the show, Pastel Scatter, he's drawing pastels with pastel. So it's this double entendre, and he's always doing that. So like, what makes my paint look like ice cream? And when he is doing meringue and frosting, he talks about whipping the pigment so that it actually almost like he's frosting the cake. He did exercises like this in part because he was also teaching his students to do this at UC Davis. He would give his students unusual exercises in composition and color. And so here you have these pastels sort of like they're randomly thrown onto a table that he's then capturing. But Thiebaud is not a random artist. He's a very thoughtful, carefully considered artist. And so every one of these pieces has landed in the perfect spot. So this work here, called Toys from 1971, is also something that he might have made his students do at UC Davis. And that the rule seems to be that he's taken these different toys, which are essentially basic shapes, and made each one of them touch the edge of the paper. The middle of the piece, which is normally where most of the activity in a painting happens, is totally empty. But again, he's looking back to his past, and here you have a cube, a sphere, basic shapes that make the composition more important than really what's being represented. These are sort of common everyday toys, a block, a ball, a little top. So they're not so important, but what really is important here is the playing with space and empty space and the formal qualities of his art, which go back to the very beginning. He said, I consider myself a formal artist. In the early 1970s, Thiebaud bought a house in the Potrero Hill neighborhood of San Francisco. And lots of very steep streets and the things you think of about San Francisco, with the buildings sort of precariously perched, the steep streets. And this was inspiring to him, and he set out to try to capture that in painting. And he went out and started to paint what he was seeing, but it wasn't the results he had hoped for. An art critic friend of his said, Edward Hopper, when he would put together his city subjects, he would go out and make sketches of various things and then put them together. And so that's what Thiebaud started to do. And what he creates is something that's both real and unreal at the same time. In that he said that was the basis of the whole series, is that it had a sense of believability, and yet it's not really possible. He had a long affinity for the city as an idea of human activity and aspiration, and that's all tied into these. These are all either drawings or prints. One of the things about this show is that even though the works may be a print or an etching, or they're oftentimes hand embellished by the artist himself, so there's very unique in their own right. He creates a lot of layers on a piece like this called Park Place from 1995, and that there's watercolor and colored pencil and crayon and all these different things on top of the print that make it a unique work. But this sense of dizzying hillsides is very much something that he invented, except he would say that Richard Diebenkorn influenced him. And Richard Diebenkorn, who was the Bay Area figurative painter, did Berkeley city scenes, but he didn't do them like this. This was totally Thiebaud. And I think San Francisco was the perfect place for such an activity. If you think of Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, focusing on the hillsides and the zooming up and down those streets, that's what he's trying to capture, is this sense that almost gives you vertigo to look at these pieces. One of the things that I know I appreciate about Thiebaud's work, and I think a lot of people appreciate, is his sense of humor. And that recurs over and over. In fact, it's important to Thiebaud as well. He says, I like when people look at my work and smile. He was, as I mentioned before, a comic strip illustrator early in his career, so that humor is natural to him. But it continues to factor into unexpected places, even into landscapes like this one. One of his big influences was the comic illustrator George Harriman, who was known for a strip called Crazy Cat. And a lot of artists were very influenced by Crazy Cat, not only Thiebaud, but Bischoff, Elmer Bischoff, and Richard Diebenkorn, and others. But here you have this wonderful sort of rural scene with this hillside that seems impossible, with this perfect light, with this little tiny cow in the middle of it. And it's very much in the spirit of George Harriman, whose comic strips were set in the desert Southwest. And you had these big mesas with these little figures. This is also one of my favorites. It's a painting called Cow Ridge. First of all, this line, this diagonal line, is something that Thiebaud, once he started to do it, he said, it seemed so wrong, and yet I couldn't stop doing it. But here you have not really 3 cows, but a bull and 2 cows. And the bull is following up on the 2 cows, and each one of them, very almost abstractly, has a little heart on their hides. And so for me, it's a little love story of this bull and his 2 cows. So there's always a lot more than meets the eye. This painting over here, Palm Tree and Cloud, is that cloud, that single cloud that's reflected in pink water, is very much in the style of Harriman, or in the spirit of Harriman. But there's oftentimes, in addition to the humor, a little dark edge to a lot of what he does. And in this case, it is a plane that's very low flying. And I think after 9/11, you're never going to be able to see a low flying plane and not feel some sort of ominous overtones. And I think that takes this luscious pink landscape and takes it a little bit darker notch than it would have otherwise. Wayne Thiebaud's San Francisco urban landscapes led kind of naturally into a new series of paintings that he started in the mid-1990s of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And these paintings were also a totally unique way of looking at the landscape of our region. They at first look a little bit like a bird's eye view, but they're much more complex than that, in that you have various perspectives going all different directions. Some things are straight on, some things are from above, some things are looking up. But he's also taken the landscape and tilted it vertically, so you get to this full impact of what you're seeing. He had seen a show of Chinese painting at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and that factors into this. But he's also borrowing from all parts of art history. One thing that Wayne Thiebaud knows very well is his art history. He taught it early on, and so he says, I will take from whatever I could borrow from so that I can create something unique. This painting is really emblematic of our region. He's talked about the rivers being like the lifeblood of agriculture, much like the Nile in Egypt was the lifeblood of Egypt. But on the other side of that equation is just a beautiful painting, in that you have all this color. And it wasn't really even until I was just giving you this tour right now, as I had never really looked at those two trees before, and they are just beautifully painted. Every single color, it seems like he had an exercise. I'm going to do every color of the rainbow in these two trees. But then there are these little vignettes, like this tractor is seen in profile, whereas you're looking at the trees from above. But he was really trying to create a feeling of a place more than an actual depiction of the place. He has lived with this landscape now for such a long time. He lived on the river. He had a farm near there. It was right in the middle of the agricultural region. So this is something that he knows well. He knows it well enough to be able to take it apart and reconstruct it. And that's what he has done in this wonderful series of landscapes, unlike anything of our region in the past. Even in his 90s, Thiebaud's work continues to evolve. And that's one of the things I admire most, is it seems like a lot of artists, they kind of get stuck on what they're known for, and they're afraid to push beyond that. But he continues to push, even in his 90s. And his most recent series of paintings are American circus clowns. And that is not a subject that is generally accepted in the art world. There's a history of harlequins and things like that in European painting, but very few artists have really done much with American circus clowns. There's just been a handful, and Wayne is one of those people. There's a lot more to these paintings than just clowns, though. They're not just circus paintings. For me, they're autobiographical. This clown with the red hair, it seems like almost like a self-portrait, in that you have someone standing under the spotlight, as Thiebaud has for so much of his career, and looks a little like the reluctant performer. His head is down. He doesn't seem totally happy being in that spotlight. And then this one, it's called Bumping Clowns, and you have these two clowns about to bump noses. A lot of people know Wayne Thiebaud loves tennis, still plays tennis. There were a doubles tennis team called the Bryan Brothers, and they had a famous chest bump when they would make a good play, so they would bump their chest. And instead of that, you have here these two clowns bumping their noses. And then this one with the dog in it and the clown with wings. And it's almost like St. Peter welcoming this dog to heaven. And on top of the surface, you have these scarifications in the paint. So it's like scars of a life well lived. And so I think if you look at these paintings deeper than the surface, you're going to find a lot of things in them. And for me, they're both joyous, but they're also tragic. And this combination of comedy and tragedy actually is encapsulated in the painting of Clown Boots. Most obviously, those clown boots are a reference to Vincent van Gogh's pairs of boots and shoes. but they have the faces of comedy and tragedy on them. And I think is a summation of much that goes into Thiebaud's work overall. And that you always have this combination of the celebration of what we are as a people, and then the hard part of what we are as a people. And I think those shoes are a perfect way to sort of end the tour. And I think if you think about them as you're looking at everything, you gain a lot more understanding of what Wayne Thiebaud was all about.